Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the opportunity to speak in this historic chamber on what is, in and of itself, a historic motion. I hope that despite my short stature, the microphone is able to pick me up. The armed forces has been deeply important to my family. My grandparents met during their national service in Cyprus, and the photo of my grandmother receiving a medal from Her late Majesty the Queen for her service in the Queen Alexandra Royal Army Nursing Corps still hangs proudly on our mantelpiece. So the opportunity to speak on such a debate is incredibly special, and I thank the President for giving me the chance. As has been mentioned previously, we speak tonight in the shadow of the 1930s motion of a similar name. However, as Izzy first recognised, it is important to note that the motions are different. In 1933, there was the under no circumstance clause, whereas tonight, this has been removed. This is incredibly significant. As Izzy said, before the burden was on the proposition to show that there is no scenario where it is necessary to fight for one's country. The circumstances of 1940 and the situation Ukraine currently finds herself in are obvious examples that when the territorial integrity of your country is threatened, it is necessary to fight. However, tonight this is not the case. We, as the proposition, must simply show that excluding these specific circumstances, military intervention has proven itself costly and ineffective in our modern world. We must first examine why one would fight for king and country. It would make sense that it would be to further your nation's interests, be that security or the safety of your citizens, or possibly for more altruistic reasons, to liberate oppressed peoples. However, recent history has shown us that in these instances, military intervention is ineffective and does not lead to a safer world. Britain in the West's invasion of Afghanistan as part of the war on terror was billed as a means to prevent future terrorist attacks and make the West safer. However, as we now withdraw nearly 20 years later, we must evaluate, has it actually been successful in accomplishing any of this? It hasn't made Britain any safer. In fact, the number of terrorist attacks in Britain has increased significantly since. We haven't made Afghanistan or its surrounding region any safer. The Taliban are back in power, and the subjugation of women has been reinstituted. But we did experience the deaths of 454 brave men and women who fought for their country and countless more who were injured. We see this again with the invasion of Iraq. Brave men and women again thought they were fighting to protect Britain's interest and keep us safe. Yet all we did was destabilize an already fractured region, creating a breeding ground for terrorism and releasing the spores from which the Islamic State grew. Without the political willpower and the certainty of enduring support, both domestic and international, military intervention in these regions is unlikely to lead to concrete progress, except providing hope to those who remain that other ways of life exist. There are far better avenues for furthering Britain's interests and resolving conflicts than fighting for one's country. Diplomacy is the most clear and obvious alternative. Perhaps the best example of this is the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. It managed to put an end to nearly 30 years of conflict, which no amount of British military intervention had been able to solve. It was a clear triumph of diplomacy and a signal that not only can it be used to prevent conflict, but also as a means to escape the exhaustion of war and violence. Go for it.
Did that diplomacy work in 1982 with the Argentines?
No, it didn't, but that was a scenario where the territorial integrity of our country was threatened, which, as I put out at the start, was one of the exceptions. Ignored. Ignored. Moreover, the influence of multilateral organizations render such diplomacy and negotiation far more effective than military solutions in our modern world. The Iranian nuclear deal is another positive example. This is not to say that multilateral institutions such as the UN and the EU are perfect. I'm sure the international relations students in the chamber can give a speech far longer than the 10 minutes we've been given on their various failings. However, unless there is a significant shift in UK foreign policy, these institutions are going to be the first avenues for conflict resolution, so we best use them to their fullest extent. Modern warfare, as the gentleman opposite will know far better than me, has the capacity to cause suffering, destruction, and chaos on a scale which many of us in this chamber cannot really hope to understand. This stacks the cards so heavily in favor of non-military solutions that these and not more warfare must be our main port of call. It is undeniable, however, that the headline, "To fight for your king and for your country," is attractive. The images it conjures of heroism, bravery, camaraderie, and honor are all appealing. Yet before we go off and fight, we must ask ourselves why. We assume that if we are fighting for king and country, we are fighting for an honorable cause. But are we? We have seen throughout history that conflicts are often justified through misunderstandings or even deliberate false pretenses. I go back to the West's military invasion of Iraq. In his 2003 address to the UN, Colin Powell, the US Secretary of State, used the phrase "weapons of mass destruction" 17 times. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. The conclusion of the Chilcot report into Iraq was that peaceful options had not been exhausted and that the existence of weapons of mass destruction had been presented with, and I quote, "unjustified certainty." Now, I shall leave it up to the discretion of members of the House for whether these were mistakes made in good faith or misinformation. But the result is the same. Thousands of men and women went to war, with many laying down their lives for a cause they believed in. And it wasn't true. If we did go to war, it would be the politicians who are sending us there. But can we really trust them to tell us the truth? Don't forget, as Izzy pointed out, these are the same politicians who told us we cannot visit our loved ones during the COVID-19 crisis whilst they held parties in Downing Street. How can we trust them and know we are fighting for a noble cause and not simply being used as pawns in a great international relations chess game? In a world filled with propaganda and misinformation, fighting for one's king and country requires tremendous faith in the statements of politicians, something I think many would be hesitant to trust. But let's imagine we do trust the politicians and we go marching off to war. You would hope that, as supposedly a developed nation with a history of military prowess, that we would be at least sending in our soldiers with the equipment and resources necessary to fulfill their duties. But again, we run into issues. A top US general recently made the rather unsettling comment that Britain is no longer a top-level fighting force. But if you look into the data from the Ministry of Defence, this is not surprising. UK defence spending as a proportion of GDP has halved since 1988, and we barely make our 2% investment target set out by NATO. Equipment has taken a hit, with a 5% decrease in armoured fighting vehicles and a 10% fall in fixed-wing aircraft. This decline in equipment and resources screams of complacency and has left our armed forces in a dire state. How can we send our citizens off to fight in a war with such budget cuts, essentially leaving them with one hand tied behind their back? For our soldiers to be so ill-equipped, unsupported by the public, and misunderstood by their politicians would be a situation too analogous to the scenario of lions led by donkeys to slaughter, like the mere cannon fodder that we witnessed in the First World War. If we are to learn our lesson, we ought to take a hard look at ourselves as a country. We must stabilise our politics, properly equip our defence and armed forces, reaffirm our position on the world stage. We must interrogate the rationales and exhaust intelligently the diplomatic routes before we rush headlong into war. Until we do this, despite the patriotic pride I have in our country and in my own family's contribution to it, I, with a heavy heart but a clear conscience, urge you to vote for the proposition tonight. Thank you.